It all began on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where the world feels calm and predictable. I was in the kitchen, sipping my coffee while staring out the window at the backyard. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on the grass. It was peaceful, until there was a sharp knock at the door. Not the friendly tap of a neighbor borrowing sugar or dropping off a plate of cookies, but the kind of knock that makes your stomach tighten. You know, the one that says, "We need to talk." When I opened the door, Karen stood there with her arms crossed, looking like she'd just discovered I'd committed some unforgivable crime. Karen lived next door, and while we weren't close, we'd always been polite. She'd wave when she saw me, and sometimes she'd even bring over leftovers from her Sunday dinners. But today, politeness was nowhere to be found. "Your backyard is a hazard," she said flatly, cutting straight to the point. Her voice had an edge to it, like she was delivering bad news to someone who didn't deserve it. I blinked at her, completely caught off guard. "What? My backyard? What are you talking about?" She gestured toward my property with a flick of her hand. "It's unsafe, and now that you've put up that fence, I can't access it anymore." "Wait, access it." My mouth dropped open. "Karen, that's my backyard. You don't get to just walk through it whenever you feel like it." Her face turned red, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "But what if there's an emergency? What if someone needs to get through? This is a safety issue." She jabbed a finger in the air for emphasis, as if this somehow made her argument stronger. "You're putting the whole neighborhood at risk." At this point, I was completely baffled. "Karen, no one has ever needed to get through my backyard before. Why would they start now?" "That's not the point," she snapped, her voice rising. "The point is, your fence blocks access. What happens if there's a fire? Or a tornado? People need to be able to move freely." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Was she serious? A fire? A tornado? In our quiet little neighborhood? Before I could respond, she whipped out her phone and started dialing. That's when it hit me. She was calling 911. "Are you seriously calling 911 because I fenced off my own yard?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "This isn't about you," she shot back, her tone icy. "It's about public safety." Public safety. Over a backyard. As the dispatcher's voice crackled through her phone speaker, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger, confusion, and a dash of amusement. How had things escalated so quickly? One moment, I was enjoying my coffee, and the next, I was apparently a danger to the entire neighborhood. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like ours, especially when Karen's involved. Neighbors whispered behind cupped hands, some giving me sympathetic looks, others glaring as though I'd done something terrible. 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, looking more curious than alarmed. One of them approached Karen first. "Ma'am, can you explain the situation?" "It's simple," Karen began, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "This woman," she pointed at me like I was on trial, "has turned her backyard into a death trap. There's no clear access for emergencies, and she refuses to cooperate with reasonable requests." The officer turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Is this true?" I sighed, trying to stay calm. "Officer, this is my private property. I installed a fence because certain neighbors kept using my backyard like it was theirs. It wasn't safe for my kids or my dog. I needed boundaries." Karen gasped audibly. "Boundaries? What about community responsibility? What happens if someone has to escape a fire or, God forbid, a tornado? Your fence blocks the only viable route." The second officer glanced between us, clearly sensing the tension. "Do you have any documentation showing your backyard is considered part of a public emergency pathway?" he asked Karen. Her confidence wavered for a split second before snapping back into place. "Of course not. But common sense should prevail here. Fences like this create hazards. Everyone knows that. Everyone except me, apparently. The arrival of the police turned what had been a bizarre argument into something that felt almost surreal. Two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their expressions calm but cautious. They weren't in a hurry, which made the situation feel even stranger. Here we were, standing in my driveway, debating whether my backyard fence was a matter of life and death. One officer approached Karen first, notebook in hand, while the other hung back, observing the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered like moths to a flame. "Ma'am," the first officer said, addressing Karen, "can you explain the situation?" Karen didn't miss a beat. She launched into her explanation with the kind of dramatic flair that would make an actor proud. "This woman," she pointed at me again, as if I might somehow disappear if she didn't keep drawing attention to me, "has turned her backyard into a hazard. There's no clear access for emergencies. What if someone needs to escape during a fire? Or worse, a tornado? Her fence blocks the only viable route." I folded my arms across my chest, trying to stay composed. The whole thing was so ridiculous that part of me wanted to laugh. But I knew better. Laughing wouldn't help my case. It would just give Karen more ammunition. Instead, I waited for the officer to turn to me, which he did after jotting down a few notes. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone neutral. "Does your fence block emergency access?" I took a deep breath before responding. "Officer, this is my private property. I installed the fence because certain neighbors—" I glanced at Karen, who was now glaring at me, "kept using my backyard without permission. It wasn't safe for my kids or my dog. I needed to set boundaries." Karen gasped loudly, as though I'd just confessed to some heinous crime. "Boundaries? What about community responsibility? What happens if someone has to escape through your yard during an emergency?" The second officer, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. "Do you have any documentation showing that your backyard is considered part of a public emergency pathway?" he asked Karen. Her face flushed red, and for a moment, she looked like she'd been caught in a lie. But then she straightened her shoulders and tried to recover. "Of course not. But common sense should prevail here. Fences like this create hazards. Everyone knows that. Everyone except me, apparently." The officers exchanged a glance, and I could tell they were trying to figure out how serious this situation really was. One of them turned to me. "Do you mind if we take a look at the fence and the backyard?" "Not at all," I said quickly. Anything to prove that my fence wasn't the disaster Karen was making it out to be. Karen followed us as we walked around to the backyard. The officers inspected the fence carefully, taking note of its height and placement. They even peeked over it to see if there was any obvious obstruction. Meanwhile, Karen kept chiming in with comments like, "See, no one can get through. And this is a safety nightmare." Finally, one of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, unless there's a specific law or regulation stating that this property must remain open for emergency access, the homeowner has the right to install a fence on their own land." Karen's mouth dropped open. But what about the neighborhood? What about emergencies?" The officer gave her a patient smile. "If there's ever an actual emergency, first responders will handle it accordingly. But as it stands, there's no violation here." You could practically see the steam coming out of Karen's ears. She opened her mouth to argue further, but the officers held up their hands. "We'll document this call and leave it at that. If you have concerns about neighborhood safety, you can bring it up with the homeowners association." With that, they headed back to their patrol car, leaving Karen and me standing in awkward silence. The neighbors who had gathered began to disperse, whispering to each other as they went. Some shot sympathetic glances my way, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Clearly, word would spread about this little showdown before the day was over. As the police car drove away, Karen turned to me, her expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You're making a huge mistake," she said sharply. "This isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," I replied, crossing my arms again. "My backyard is my property, Karen. You don't get to decide how I use it." She narrowed her eyes at me, then spun on her heel and marched back to her house, slamming her front door behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at her house, feeling the strange mix of relief and unease. The immediate crisis had passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, as I sat on my couch replaying the events of the day in my head, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just upset about the fence. This was about control. She was used to getting her way, and my decision to put up the fence had disrupted that. And if I knew anything about people like Karen, it was that they didn't give up easily. Whatever came next, I knew I had to be ready for it. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I knew Karen wasn't the type to let things go quietly. Sure enough, when I checked the mailbox later that day, there it was, a certified letter from the Homeowners Association. My heart sank as I tore open the envelope and read the contents. It was official now. Karen had filed a formal complaint against me with the HOA. The letter accused me of violating multiple HOA rules. One claim stood out in particular, the allegation that my fence obstructed emergency access pathways. There was also a comment about how the fence disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Aesthetic harmony? Really? It's just a simple wooden fence painted white. I stared at the words, trying to process what I was reading. Was this really happening? Furious and more than a little confused, I decided to confront Karen directly. I marched over to her house, letter in hand, and knocked on her door. She answered almost immediately, wearing a smug expression that made my blood boil. "Oh, did you get the letter?" she said sweetly, as though she'd been expecting me. I figured it was best to involve the HOA. After all, these issues affect everyone. These issues, I repeated, incredulous. "Karen, you were trespassing. That's why I put up the fence in the first place." Her smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly recovered. "I wasn't trespassing. I was ensuring the backyard remained accessible for emergencies. If you'd simply consulted with the HOA before making such drastic changes, none of this would have happened." Consulted with the HOA? Was she serious? This wasn't about safety or accessibility. It was about control. And suddenly, it all clicked into place. Karen wasn't fighting for emergency routes. She was fighting to maintain her sense of entitlement. The backyard had become her personal shortcut, and my fence had ruined that convenience. Now she was using the HOA as a weapon to force me back into line. As I walked back home, my mind raced. How could something so small spiral into such a mess? I thought about calling Mark, my husband, to vent, but he was at work, and I didn't want to bother him with another update on what felt like an endless drama. Instead, I sat down at the kitchen table and started researching. If Karen wanted to play hardball, then fine. I'd learn the rules of the game. Hours later, I emerged from my laptop-induced haze with some surprising discoveries. First, there was no official document or bylaw stating that my backyard had to remain open for emergency access. The HOA's claim was baseless. Second, the aesthetic harmony argument was vague and subjective. Essentially, they were accusing me of having bad taste without any concrete evidence to back it up. Armed with this information, I felt a flicker of hope. But I also knew this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA had power in this neighborhood, and Karen clearly had influence within it. If I wanted to stand my ground, I'd need more than just facts. I'd need allies. That evening, I went for a walk around the block, hoping to gauge how other neighbors felt about the situation. Some avoided eye contact, clearly wanting no part of the drama. Others gave me polite smiles but said nothing. Finally, I ran into Mr. Thompson, the older man who always seemed to be peeking through his curtains. He was outside watering his plants, and when he saw me, he gave a small wave. "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" I asked hesitantly. He nodded and turned off the hose. "Sure thing. What's on your mind?" I explained everything. The fence, Karen's complaints, the HOA letter, and watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to something resembling anger. "This isn't the first time Karen's pulled something like this," he admitted. "She's got friends on the HOA board, and they use those so-called rules to bully people into doing what they want." My eyes widened. "You mean this has happened before?" "More times than I can count," he said grimly. "But most folks just cave because they don't want the hassle. You're not planning to give in, are you?" "No," I said firmly, "but I don't know if I can fight them alone." Mr. Thompson studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You won't have to. Let me see what I can do." As I headed back home, I felt a strange mix of emotions: hope, fear, determination. Whatever came next, one thing was clear. This battle wasn't just about my backyard anymore. It was about standing up for myself and proving that I wouldn't be pushed around. And maybe, just maybe, I could inspire others to do the same. The next few days felt like a whirlwind. After my conversation with Mr. Thompson, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing beneath the surface of our quiet neighborhood. It wasn't just about me and Karen anymore. It was about the power dynamics in Maplewood Lane. The HOA had been pulling strings for years, and now it seemed like people were finally starting to notice. Mr. Thompson didn't waste any time. He stopped by my house the very next evening, holding a thick folder stuffed with papers. "I've been keeping track of the HOA's antics for a while," he said as he handed it over. His voice was calm but firm, like he'd been waiting for someone to challenge the status quo. "They've bullied plenty of families out of this neighborhood, but maybe together we can stop them." Inside the folder were notes, emails, and even copies of old HOA meeting minutes. Some of it was hard to follow at first glance, but one thing became crystal clear. The HOA had been making up rules as they went along. That so-called emergency access clause. It didn't exist in the official bylaws. Someone, likely Karen herself, had slipped it into a meeting agenda years ago without ever putting it to a formal vote. No one had questioned it until now. Armed with this new information, I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs where neighbors politely discussed flowered colors or holiday decorations. But tonight, the room buzzed with tension. Word had spread about my fence, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. When I walked in, heads turned, whispers erupted, and I could feel dozens of eyes boring into me. Karen sat at the front table with her usual air of superiority, flanked by two other board members who looked equally smug. She gave me a tight smile as I took a seat near the back. For a moment, I felt small and outnumbered, but then I remembered why I was here. This wasn't about me. It was about fairness, about standing up for what was right. When it came time for public comments, I stood up, clutching my folder tightly. My heart pounded as all eyes focused on me, but I forced myself to speak clearly and confidently. "There's been a lot of talk about my backyard fence recently," I began. "Some claim it violates HOA rules about emergency access, but after reviewing the official documents, I found no such rule exists." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Furthermore," I continued, "the accusation that my fence disrupts aesthetic harmony is subjective and discriminatory. If the HOA wants to enforce aesthetic standards, they need clear guidelines, not vague complaints based on personal preferences." Karen cut in sharply, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're twisting the truth. Everyone knows these pathways are essential for emergencies. Your fence puts lives at risk." "No, Karen," I shot back, surprising even myself with how steady my voice sounded. "What puts lives at risk is misinformation and bullying. You're using fear tactics to justify your own convenience." For the first time, I saw cracks forming in her confident facade. Her cheeks flushed red, and she glanced nervously at the other board members. Around the room, neighbors exchanged glances, some nodding thoughtfully, others whispering behind their hands. It was subtle, but I could tell I wasn't alone in questioning the HOA's methods. After the meeting ended, several residents approached me to express support. One woman confessed that she'd been fined unfairly last year for painting her front door a shade of blue not approved by the HOA. Another man admitted he wanted to install solar panels, but backed down after threats of penalties. Slowly but surely, a coalition began to form, a group of neighbors tired of living under the HOA's thumb. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table drafting petitions and organizing evidence, I realized something important. This fight wasn't just about my backyard anymore. It was about reclaiming our sense of community and proving that kindness and cooperation could outweigh control and intimidation. Whatever happened next, I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in Maplewood Lane grew thicker than ever. Word of my standoff with the HOA spread like wildfire, and opinions were divided. Some neighbors cheered me on, slipping supportive notes into my mailbox or giving me encouraging smiles as they passed by. Others, however, weren't so kind. Anonymous letters began appearing on my doorstep, thin envelopes filled with harsh words accusing me of being selfish and disruptive. One note even suggested I didn't belong in the neighborhood. Then came the vandalism. One morning, I walked outside to find someone had keyed my car overnight. Angry scratches ran along the driver's side door, gleaming under the pale light of dawn. My stomach churned as I stared at the damage. It was petty, yes, but it felt personal, like a warning. Mark noticed how shaken I was when he left for work that day. "Are you sure about this?" he asked gently. "Maybe we should just let it go." I wanted to say yes, to tell him he was right, that fighting wasn't worth all the stress and hostility, but something inside me refused to back down. "If I give in now," I said firmly, "they'll keep pushing until there's nothing left of our autonomy. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been silenced." Mark didn't argue, but I could see the worry etched on his face. He wasn't the only one feeling uneasy. Sleep became elusive, replaced by endless nights replaying arguments in my head. Was I doing the right thing? Or was I sacrificing my peace of mind for a principle? The questions haunted me, but deep down, I knew I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Meanwhile, Karen ramped up her campaign against me. She went door to door, rallying support from anyone who would listen. "She's ruining the neighborhood," I overheard her telling one neighbor. "Her fence is an eyesore, and she has no respect for community values." Her voice carried through the crisp autumn air, sharp and accusatory. It made my skin crawl, knowing she was twisting the truth to turn others against me. But not everyone fell for her act. Slowly, more neighbors started reaching out to offer their help. Mr. Thompson became my unofficial advisor, sharing stories of past HOA disputes and helping me strategize. A young couple down the street offered to circulate petitions demanding transparency from the board. Even Mrs. Harper, who rarely spoke to anyone, quietly admitted she'd always disliked how controlling the HOA was. "They think they own us," she muttered during one brief conversation. It's time someone stood up to them. Encouraged by the growing support, I decided to escalate our efforts. We organized a secret meeting at Mr. Thompson's house, a safe space where we could discuss strategies without fear of retaliation. Sitting around his dining table, surrounded by neighbors I barely knew before this ordeal, I felt a strange sense of camaraderie. These people weren't just allies. They were proof that change was possible. We drafted formal complaints to the HOA, outlining every instance of bullying and favoritism we'd uncovered. We filed grievances with local authorities, questioning the legality of certain HOA practices. Most importantly, we started talking openly about the issues, refusing to let fear silence us any longer. Still, the pressure mounted. Every morning brought new challenges, threatening letters, cold stares, whispered accusations. There were moments when I wondered if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But then I'd look out at my backyard, at the fence I'd fought so hard to keep, and remind myself why I was doing this. Boundaries weren't just lines on a map. They were symbols of freedom and self-respect. And if I gave up now, what message would that send? To my family, to my neighbors, to myself. One evening, As I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized something important. This battle wasn't just about winning or losing. It was about standing firm in the face of adversity, about proving that kindness and fairness could triumph over intimidation and greed. No matter what happened next, I knew I was on the right side of this fight. The turning point came unexpectedly, like a crack of lightning on an otherwise clear day. It started with a phone call from Mr. Thompson. "You need to see this," he said, his voice unusually urgent. When I arrived at his house later that afternoon, he was sitting at his kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers and printouts. In front of him lay a document that would change everything. "This," he said, tapping the paper emphatically, "is the smoking gun." The document was an email chain between Karen and several HOA board members, dating back years. It revealed how they had manipulated rules to target homeowners who didn't conform to their vision of perfection. One section detailed how fines were arbitrarily assigned to families who couldn't afford legal battles, forcing them to sell their homes. Another outlined plans to block improvements like solar panels or garden expansions unless the homeowner agreed to negotiate privately, usually involving favors or concessions. My hands trembled as I read through the emails. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was proof of a systemic issue, a pattern of abuse cloaked in the guise of neighborhood harmony. For the first time, I understood why so many people had left Maplewood Lane without explanation. They hadn't moved away because of job transfers or life changes. They'd been pushed out. Armed with this evidence, we took action. Mr. Thompson suggested filing a formal complaint with the City Council, accusing the HOA of misconduct and demanding an investigation. At first, I hesitated. Going up against the HOA felt risky enough, but involving local authorities, that seemed like stepping into uncharted territory. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. If we wanted real change, we needed outside help. We submitted the complaint along with copies of the incriminating emails and testimonies from other neighbors. Within days, the news spread throughout the community. Some residents were shocked. Others weren't surprised at all. A few even joined our cause, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment. One elderly woman recounted how the HOA fined her repeatedly for having a wheelchair ramp installed, claiming it disrupted curb appeal. Another family described being pressured to repaint their home after choosing a color not explicitly listed in the guidelines. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Karen, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate. She held impromptu meetings, trying to rally support for the HOA's actions. But her arguments fell flat. Neighbors who once nodded along now questioned her motives. When she accused us of spreading lies, someone shouted, "Then explain those emails." Her face turned pale, and she stormed off, leaving behind murmurs of discontent. The pressure mounted on the HOA board. 2 members resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons. Others distanced themselves publicly, afraid of being associated with scandal. Even the usually impenetrable Mrs. Patterson, the unofficial queen of the HOA, began avoiding eye contact when she passed me on the street. As momentum built, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. What began as a personal battle over a backyard fence had evolved into something much larger, a movement to reclaim our neighborhood from fear and control. There were still moments of doubt, late at night when the weight of everything pressed down on me. But each morning, I woke up determined to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for everyone who deserved a fair shot at calling Maplewood Lane home. One evening, as Mark and I sat together on the porch, he turned to me and said, "You've changed, you know that." I raised an eyebrow, unsure what he meant. "You're stronger," he continued, "more confident. Whatever happens next, I'm proud of you." His words stayed with me long after he went inside. Maybe this fight had taken its toll, but it had also taught me something invaluable. Standing up for yourself doesn't just protect your boundaries. It inspires others to do the same. And that realization gave me hope, not just for my future, but for the future of Maplewood Lane. The final chapter of this saga unfolded in ways I never could have predicted. It began with a letter from the city council, a formal acknowledgement of our complaint, and an announcement that they would launch an investigation into the HOA's practices. The news spread quickly, sending ripples through Maplewood Lane. For the first time, it felt like the balance of power was shifting. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now spoke openly about their frustrations. Others volunteered to testify, adding their voices to the growing chorus demanding accountability. Karen, however, wasn't ready to go down without a fight. She called an emergency HOA meeting, clearly hoping to rally her remaining supporters. But when the night arrived, only a handful of people showed up, and most of them seemed more curious than loyal. As she stood at the front of the room, her usual confidence faltered. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, pacing back and forth. "They're trying to destroy everything we've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," someone muttered from the back. Heads turned toward the speaker, a young father named Greg who had recently joined our cause. His voice carried a quiet defiance that silenced the room. "You've been bullying people for years, Karen. Maybe it's time you faced consequences." For a moment, no one said anything. Then another neighbor chimed in. "He's right. We deserve better leadership, people who actually care about the community, not just control." Karen's face flushed red, but she didn't argue. Instead, she stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the first time, we saw cracks forming in her armor. Weeks later, the city council released its findings. The report was damning, detailing years of misconduct, favoritism, and abuse of power by the HOA board. Several members were formally reprimanded, while others resigned voluntarily to avoid further scrutiny. Karen, unsurprisingly, bore the brunt of the backlash. Her name appeared repeatedly in the report, linked to incidents of harassment and manipulation. Within days, moving trucks pulled up outside her house, and she quietly disappeared from the neighborhood. With the old guard dismantled, new leadership stepped in, actual neighbors who cared more about fostering kindness than enforcing arbitrary rules. Emergency access pathways, aesthetic harmony. Those vague, subjective claims vanished from the books, replaced by clear, reasonable guidelines. Fines dropped significantly, and for the first time in years, Maplewood Lane breathed freely again. As for me, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. The fence remained standing, a symbol of resilience and personal freedom. My kids played safely in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the air. Even Mark seemed lighter, joking that maybe we'd finally earned some peace. One sunny afternoon, as I stood in my yard watching the world around me, Mr. Thompson approached with a smile. "Looks like you did it," he said simply. "I didn't do it alone," I replied, glancing at the neighbors chatting happily on their porches. "We all did." He nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you started it. You reminded us what it means to stand up for ourselves and each other." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. This battle hadn't just been about fences or fines. It had been about reclaiming our sense of community, about proving that kindness and cooperation could outweigh fear and intimidation. And while the scars of the past lingered, the keyed car, the sleepless nights, they served as reminders of how far we'd come. Standing there, surrounded by the sounds of life returning to Maplewood Lane, I realized something profound. Sometimes fighting for your home isn't just about protecting your space. It's about building a place where everyone can truly belong. And for the first time in a long time, mine finally felt like home.